Hey everyone, and welcome to Brent's Notepad, where ideas become insight. I'm Brent Shelton, inviting you to think deeper, lead better, and live more intentionally. In each episode, I dive into big questions and meaningful ideas drawn from books, research, and real life. Today, we're diving into Chapter 4 of Exploring Leadership, the second edition written by Richard Bolden, Jonathan Gosling, and Beverley Hawkins. In Chapter 4, the authors continue to examine individual perspectives of leadership by considering the relationship between leaders and followers. In doing so, the authors give us a multi-layered look at how authenticity, emotion, narrative, and identities shape leadership in powerful and sometimes surprising ways. So let's dive in. The authors begin this chapter by reviewing the basic tenets of transformational and transactional leadership. Let's start with transformational leadership. Transformational leaders don't just manage tasks. They engage with the hearts and minds of their followers. They inspire people to grow, to believe in a shared vision, and to go farther than they thought possible. Some of the ways that transformational leaders engage with the hearts and minds of their followers is through what Bass and Avolio call the 4 I's. The first I stands for idealized influence, which means that leaders serve as a role model. The second I is inspirational motivation. This means that leaders create a compelling vision that energizes and inspires followers. The third I is intellectual stimulation. This means that leaders challenge assumptions and encourage new ways of thinking to spark creativity. The fourth I is individual consideration. This means that leaders mentor and support the unique needs of their followers. Taken together, these 4 qualities make transformational leadership morally grounded and deeply motivating by empowering followers, building trust, and creating long-term change that goes beyond short-term goals. Now let's contrast this with transactional leadership. Transactional leadership is based on the exchange between leaders and followers. In other words, leaders motivate their followers through contingent rewards, where rewards are given in exchange for satisfactory performance. Additionally, transactional leaders often demonstrate active and passive management by exception. Active management by exception is where leaders actively monitor performance and intervene to avoid mistakes, where passive management by exception is where leaders assign tasks, wait for a mistake to happen before intervening, and then move in with corrective actions or punishment. Overall, transactional leadership is very structured, it's efficient, and really useful in stable environments where consistency matters. Think about a factory line, the military, or the necessity to meet quarterly sales goals. Now, I know what you're thinking. All of us probably prefer the warm and cuddly transformational leader. However, in reality, the best leaders know how to use both. They rely on the transactional tools to provide the structure and accountability that's necessary. However, they also lean on the transformational qualities in order to cast a vision, drive innovation, and to uniquely support their followers. So, rather than asking which is better, I think the more useful question is, when should I be transactional or when should I be transformational? All right. Now I'd like to introduce you to what I like to call the cousin of transformational and transactional leadership, in what the authors call charismatic leadership. Charismatic leaders are often seen as naturally magnetic or born to lead. Think back to the great man theory that we've talked about over the past couple episodes. However, charisma, while it may appear to be an innate characteristic to some leaders, the sociologist Max Weber suggests that charisma is actually highly subjective and it's held in the eyes of the followers. In other words, the person who is perceived as highly charismatic to one may not be so attractive to another. And I think a great example of this is President Donald Trump. Now, politics aside, charismatic leaders tend to display a few common characteristics. The first, they are typically highly self-confident with a dominant personality and the desire to influence others. Charismatic leaders also exemplify themselves as a strong role model with high levels of competence. They also articulate their ideas very well and have somewhat of a moral overtone. Lastly, charismatic leaders typically have high expectations of their followers However, they have the confidence that they will meet their expectations. Now, you might have picked up on this, but charismatic leadership also has an underbelly. Charisma can be intoxicating and even dangerous, especially when it leads to unchecked power. Think about all of history's cautionary tales of the leaders who stirred up emotion but then manipulated trust. So, with this in mind, the authors lead us into what they call leadership authenticity. Now, when I think of authenticity, I'm reminded of the phrase, just be yourself. But in this chapter, the authors wisely challenge that simplicity. In chapter 4, the author suggests that authentic leadership means being true to your values, but that doesn't mean an unfiltered self-expression at all times. In leadership, emotional regulation and situational awareness are critical. Being authentic doesn't mean saying everything you feel. It means aligning your values, your words, and actions in a way that resonates with others. And this is why the authors lead us to the idea of emotional intelligence. It's because leadership, it's an emotional practice. It involves being aware of your own emotions, understanding others' emotions, and managing emotional responses appropriately, and then using the emotional insights to guide and direct your decisions and relationships. But why does this matter? It's because leadership is about setting a direction and guiding people through uncertainty, tension, and change. And emotional intelligence is where you stay grounded, resilient, and compassionate when the pressure is on. And this isn't just some soft skills talk. In fact, emotional intelligence has been linked in many research studies to demonstrate better team outcomes, stronger morale, and even higher organizational performance. And one of the most compelling points this chapter makes is that while organizations may appear to be rational, they are deeply emotional spaces. People bring their frustration, doubt, passion, hope, and everything in between. And leaders must be equipped to channel that energy productively. Okay, at this point, the authors ask us to consider leadership as a narrative practice, which positions leaders as storytellers. And to me, this makes a lot of sense because humans are storytelling machines. We love to make sense out of reality through a good narrative, which in turn makes leadership a narrative practice. Leaders can shape stories that unite people, create a shared meaning, and energize action. But here's the catch. Leaders don't fully control the narrative. We live in a world of memes and reels and 24/7 media attention with endless opportunities to reinterpret a leader's narrative. So, in a sense, considering leadership as a narrative practice, this creates both power and vulnerability for leaders. They can craft a story, but they also become a character in it. And sometimes, that character takes a life of its own. Another suggestion the authors give us is to consider leadership as identity work. But what does that mean? Well, it means that becoming a leader isn't just about identifying effective traits, styles, skills, competencies, or even relationships. It's about learning how you see yourself and how others see you. Considering leadership as identity work, we can see that our leadership identity intersects with all of our other identities, such as race, gender, profession, religion, and the list goes on. Therefore, we are constantly negotiating who we are as a leader in relation to the people around us. And it's not always a smooth process. It often leads to imposter syndrome and even self-doubt. But the authors remind us that even the best leaders sometimes struggle to reconcile their multiple identities. Overall, considering leadership as identity work reminds us that leadership is not purely strategic or rational. It's emotional, relational, and deeply human. Now, as I sit back and think about all of the leadership considerations given to us by the authors in this chapter, what stands out the most to me is just how layered and intertwined these leadership concepts really are. We often like to draw clear lines between the leadership discourse, but in reality, they overlap and evolve in practice. Think about it. A stereotypical transactional leader who wants to bring about real change in an organization has to connect emotionally and inspire his followers and be perceived as credible. And that's where the ideas of charisma and authenticity come in. You can't motivate people to pursue a bold new vision if they don't trust your motives or feel that you're emotionally connected to your message. So it's a balancing act because too much charisma without moral grounding can feel manipulative, and being authentic without emotional regulation can come across as reckless or self-indulgent. And that's why emotional intelligence felt like the linchpin for me. It tied everything together. Leaders need the ability to tune into their own emotional landscape and the signals others are sending, which is exactly what helps leaders respond instead of reacting. It helps them stay calm under pressure and to make decisions that account not just for the outcomes, but for the people themselves. I was also struck by how powerful it is to consider leadership as a narrative practice. I found it very interesting that a leader who tells a good story can truly help his followers make sense of a complex situation and remind them why their work matters. But I was also challenged by this concept because once a leader starts to tell a story, they also become a part of it. They're no longer just the narrator. They're also a character who is being observed, interpreted, and sometimes redefined by others. And in an age of social media, that story can get away from them pretty quickly. Finally, considering leadership as identity work, that really made me think about the ongoing and unfinished nature of my leadership identity. Leadership isn't just a title you earn once and keep forever. It's something that we're constantly shaping and reshaping through experiences. In other words, we never fully arrive. And sometimes that process is uncomfortable because we all wrestle with things like imposter syndrome and the question of whether we're leading in the right way. But remember, there is no such thing as leading in the right way. And while this uncertainty can be unsettling, I also find comfort in the sense that leadership is about becoming rather than being. And actually, this is what makes leadership so human. It's not about projecting perfection. It's about staying in the process, grounded in your values, open to growth, and willing to hold a space for the emotional weight that leadership often carries. And for me, this chapter wasn't just about how to lead better. It was about how to live as a leader, more fully, more honest, and more emotionally present. That's it for today's episode. Thanks for listening to Brent's Notepad, where ideas become insight. Until next time, lead better, think deeper, and live more intentionally.